It's Game Boy World, and this is a dose of perspective. We've reached June 1990 with Game Boy World's chronological journey through the system's library, and already, 14 months after the console's debut, we have our very first sequel to another Game Boy game. 1990 will actually bring several sequels to 1989 releases, including the Final Fantasy Legend and even Trump Boy II, the sequel to a game released in early 1990. But there's something utterly and completely fitting about the Game Boy lineup's first ever self-sequel, because you see, it's Boxxle II. Could there ever be any game more appropriate to serve as Game Boy's first Roman numeral II? Given how many games we've seen so far that have their roots in Sokoban, the arrival of Boxxle II less than a year after the first seems almost inevitable. Predestined. In a happier world, this would be where I declare, at last, the original returns to show them all how it's done. But that's not really the case at all. On the contrary, the arrival of Boxxle II serves as something of a bookend to the past year's worth of game releases. Rather than show us all how it's done, Boxxle II is more like a reference point so we can appreciate how creative Game Boy's Sokoban derivatives have been. There's almost exactly no difference between Boxxle II and its predecessor. The music's changed, there's a weird plot about an alien kidnapping the hero's lady friend, whom he worked so hard to impress in the original. Oh, and it's by far the scarcest Game Boy title we've seen to date. Maybe FCI knew that this game was barely worth releasing in light of all the puzzle game advancement that's happened since the original Boxxle dropped, because by all appearances they seem to have severely underproduced it. As in the first Boxxle, play consists entirely of pushing, not pulling, boxes around various oddly shaped warehouses in an attempt to cover certain specially marked spaces. Because you can't pull, you have to be extraordinarily cautious about moving boxes against walls or into other situations where they'll become stuck. Also, as with the first game, Boxxle II comes to us courtesy of Fuji-SNK labels Pony Canyon and FCI, with development duties handled by Atelier Double. It's licensed by, but not made by, Sokoban creators Thinking Rabbit. Thinking Rabbit's efforts at the time had instead been poured into the true Sokoban sequel, 1989's Sokoban Perfect for NEC's PC 9801. The original Boxxle offered 120 stages, and Boxxle II offers the same. That's 240 stages between the two Game Boy releases, which combined adds up to about 3/4 of the 300 plus puzzles included in Sokoban Perfect. There's honestly not much more to say about Boxxle II. We've seen so many puzzle games since the release of its predecessor, and so many more inventive takes on the Sokoban and general puzzle concepts, that this really does feel like a release for die-hard puzzle traditionalists only. Actually, the release of Boxxle II seems like a perfect excuse to revisit the world of Game Boy puzzlers. Let's look back and see what the past year has brought us, shall we? Puzzlers of a Sort actually debuted on Game Boy before Boxxle. Nintendo and Bulletproof gave us Tetris just a few weeks after the system's launch. That was quickly followed by HAL's port of Shanghai. The former set the standard for what most people think of as puzzle games these days, dropping objects and making matches, while the latter was also focused on matches, though without the emphasis on quick reflexes and planning. After Boxxle, we had two platformers that straddled the line between puzzle and arcade action, the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle and Hyper Load Runner. The former owed a debt to the latter, really, sending players across maze-like platforms while being pursued by relentless foes. For the most part, Game Boy puzzlers can be grouped into three basic schools of design based on these early releases: box pushing a la Boxxle, matching and removing pieces a la Tetris, and maze navigation a la Hyper Load Runner. The Tetris school is the loosest and least common, surprisingly enough, despite Tetris's importance in the grand scheme of the Game Boy's life, and despite it becoming the de facto style that comes to mind for most people when you say puzzle game. Falling blocks and matching pieces appear in far fewer Game Boy titles than skating about mazes, or pushing boxes, or skating about mazes pushing boxes. The most decidedly Tetris-like Game Boy title we've seen to date has been Konami's Quarth, which combined shoot-'em-up action with a mission to make four-piece blocks vanish. Flipple also fell into the same family, challenging you to create matches by kicking patterned blocks into a random pile of pieces. You can probably also count Daedalian Opus within the same family, as it plays up the jigsaw puzzle aspect of Tetris without the pressure that comes from time or deadlines. And finally there was Blodia, which sits at the extreme outer boundary of this format. However, with its central theme of rearranging blocks of different shapes into proper alignment, it still shares a spiritual connection. Of course, Blodia's source material predates Tetris's by a couple of years, but whatever. Surprisingly, the most prolific of Game Boy's puzzle antecedents has been Lode Runner. Besides the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle, Lode Runner's maze chase format has also inspired more than half a dozen other games. We had Penguin Land, wherein you attempted to guide an egg downward through a hazardous maze by digging holes, Boomer's Adventure in Asmic World, wherein you hunted for keys and trapped foes by digging holes, SD Lupin III, which had you smashing up the entire maze in order to trap and reset foes, and Heiyankyo Alien, which also revolved around digging holes to trap maze monsters. But that technically predated Lode Runner as well, so it only half counts. We'll tentatively count Popeye, Lock and Chase, and Snoopy's Magic Show in this category, even though all of them fell a little closer to the Pac-Man maze chase end of the spectrum than Lode Runner. Anyway, the finest specimen of this species by far was the bizarre but inventive Psy-Raid, which added block kicking and ladder kicking to the Lode Runner formula. Still, while Sokoban-likes haven't been the most prolific puzzle format on Game Boy, they've been far more faithful to their source material than other puzzlers, which have typically roamed further afield. Game Boy's first proper Boxxle-alike arrived shortly after Hyper Lode Runner in the form of Atlus's Quirk. Quirk set the tone for Game Boy box puzzlers to come. It clearly used Boxxle and Sokoban as an inflection point, yet it took a far more varied approach to the premise. Rather than simply pushing one square boxes, the protagonist of Quirk shuffled objects of various shapes and sizes. Not only that, but many movable objects in Quirk rotated around a fulcrum point that allowed you to spin them. To top it all off, Quirk also included a couple of different modes to add greater variety and a sense of progression to its action. Next, we had Cubillion, which fell somewhere between Boxxle and Shanghai. It featured the block pushing of the former, but involved the stacked tiles of the latter. In effect, it literally added a new dimension to Sokoban. Then there was Flappy Special, which bore a superficial resemblance to Penguin Land. Gravity factored in as you dropped rocks on monsters, even if the player's movements seemed to work more like those of a top-down rather than side-view game. But with the emphasis firmly on pushing rocks to a target tile rather than on digging holes and fretting quite so much about hazards, Flappy really seemed more of a Sokoban variant. And most recently, there was Cat Trap. Like many of these games, Cat Trap descended from an early 80s PC title, but its rewind feature made it feel more like something from the future than from the past. Cat Trap set an incredibly high bar for Game Boy puzzlers, and by comparison, Boxxle II falls tragically short. And yet, my utter disinterest in Boxxle II has less to do with Cat Trap's excellence and more to do with the final piece in the puzzle genre which preceded Boxxle II's release. A little game called Dexterity, or as it's known in Japan, Funny Field.
I love your funny face.
No, Funny Field. Dexterity actually falls into the Game Boy's little-seen fourth puzzle category, the Pac-Man-inspired territory conquest format game. I talked about this a bit in the Q*bert episode of Retronauts Micro, go watch it, but Pac-Man inspired a great many games in the early 80s. Many Pac-Man derivatives tried to copy the maze aspect of the game. However, quite a few developers chose instead to look to the aspect of Pac-Man that involved conquering space. Q*bert was one of those games, and so was Lock and Chase. You also had a few others that copied the formula precisely, including Crush Roller, also known as Make Tracks, as well as more generous interpretations, such as Game Boy's very own Quicks and Serpent. Dexterity falls along very similar lines, and in many ways, Crush Roller seems like the most relevant predecessor here. The games don't simply feature a somewhat similar style. Crush Roller quite neatly ties together many threads that define Dexterity's existence. That game was released under a huge number of different titles in various territories, but the most interesting of these names was Pack and Paint, a not at all legitimate or licensed attempt to ride the Pac-Man-like gameplay off of Namco's coattails. Crush Roller's maze-centric gameplay tasked players with covering the entirety of the playfield with paint. Monsters wandered about the maze and could be halted briefly with the use of a few special limited items, and most relevantly to our discussion, certain enemies could undo the player's progress by leaving footprints in the fresh paint. Dexterity opens up the maze in favor of more freeform tile-based stages, but the fundamental principles remain. You play by claiming tiles while your enemies, which are deadly to the touch, attempt to undermine your progress by reverting colors. Dexterity was the very first Game Boy released by SNK. In a case of tremendously strange timing, Dexterity debuted for Nintendo's handheld about 6 weeks after SNK entered the console market itself with the Neo Geo. It's safe to assume that SNK didn't see Nintendo's low-end portable business as a direct competitor to its high-spec arcade hardware, which was initially sold strictly for public venues rather than for home use. But it does seem somewhat bizarre to think that the company entered the Game Boy market so soon after debuting what would become its major bid for the console market. That's neither here nor there, of course. The real significance of Dexterity's parentage is that it ties the game to Crush Roller. Crush Roller had been designed by Alpha Denshi, and Alpha Denshi, as you may know, was essentially synonymous with SNK by the time Dexterity arrived, having committed themselves to working almost exclusively on SNK arcade hardware back in 1987. In fact, Alpha Denshi created the two most impressive Neo Geo launch titles which had debuted, again, shortly before Dexterity: Ninja Combat and Magician Lord. Given Alpha Denshi's close ties to SNK, it seems pretty likely that Dexterity was directly inspired by Crush Roller and had the original developer's blessing. Given the opacity of Game Boy development, Dexterity could well have been made by Alpha Denshi's staff. Its credits list a bunch of people whose names have never appeared in any other game, meaning those credits were probably all pseudonymous. Well, whoever made it, Dexterity is a great action puzzler. It's fast-paced, surprisingly complex, and challenging without being needlessly harsh. Like all the best puzzlers, Dexterity presents players with simple rules that it puts to use in increasingly complex ways. You begin play on a field of light tiles, and your goal is to simply swap them all for dark tiles. You don't even technically have to flip all squares to dark. In many stages, you'll find movable blocks that can be shifted to reveal active tiles to claim. If you slide a box over top of a light tile, it still counts as converted. So long as you can't see any light tiles, all's well, and you win. To flip a tile, you simply need to stand atop it and press A. At the beginning, this swaps only the tile you're standing on, but the mechanic has more complexity than it initially seems. If the tile you flip has an unobstructed line of sight with another tile you've claimed in any of the cardinal directions, you won't simply take the square you're currently occupying, you'll claim all spaces in between as well. In a sense, Dexterity owes as much to Othello or Taikyoku Renju as it does to Crush Roller. Of course, Go derivatives like Othello were never quite as stressful as Dexterity. As you attempt to claim the maze, a number of monsters wander the same space, doing their level best to undo your work or simply make things more confusing. At the beginning, you'll encounter two kinds of monsters: wandering dudes who make a beeline for any dark spaces and revert them back to light one by one, and erratic creatures that move unpredictably and flip tiles indiscriminately in either direction. The further you advance into the game, the more varied your enemies become, not to mention more dangerous. Enemies can be a true nuisance, but the important thing about Dexterity is not to let them rattle you. They're deadly to the touch, but very few enemies actively seek you out. They're more concerned with reversing all your hard work. Plus, you have a few offensive capabilities to use against the bad guys. If you happen to flip the spaces beneath them when you claim a row of tiles, the color change will stun them for several seconds. Once you reach stages with movable tiles and boxes, you can also pin enemies or even crush them to take them out of play temporarily. Of course, these tactics don't work on all enemies. Later in the game, you'll encounter monsters who can also push blocks, who not only can't be trapped, but can just as easily crush your protagonist against the walls. Adding to the general stress level, every level is timed. This may not seem like a big deal at the beginning when you have lots of time to clear big open arenas of tiles, but as playfields grow more complex and countdowns more restrictive, the incessant pinging of the clock has an uncanny ability to goad you into taking needless risks and making deadly mistakes. And Dexterity isn't infinitely forgiving the way many puzzle games are. You have a limited number of lives and only a few continues to burn through, so seeing the game through to the end requires practice and skill. The game has 30 levels altogether, which doesn't seem like much until you start hitting the really challenging, complex brick wall levels halfway through. For those who master the standard game, however, Dexterity also offers a more demanding secondary mode, a multi-stage challenge in which you have to clear 5 fields all at once. These stages appear to be drawn from the standard mode, but being forced to complete 5 different fields at a time is crazy difficult. This mode does offer a few neat features though. The screen you begin on serves as a sort of hub, and you can duck over to the other levels at any time by walking off the edge of the screen. Leaving and re-entering a field resets all enemy positions, which can potentially work to your advantage, though it can also make a level totally unbeatable if you're not careful, since toggling screens doesn't reset the position of boxes. On the other hand, it doesn't reset the tiles you've claimed, so there's a lot of strategy to sort out here through trial and error. All in all, Dexterity is one of the most exhilarating and intricate puzzle games we've yet seen on Game Boy, combining influences from a huge number of games we've seen over the past year of the console's life. In many ways, it works as a culmination of Game Boy to date, which is great for everyone, except Boxxle II, which launched in Japan a week after Dexterity and feels feeble and dated in comparison. Still, Boxxle II has its place, which is basically to show just how far the platform and its puzzlers have come since the original Boxxle debuted, 50-odd episodes ago. It's a sacrifice upon the altar of progress. And with that recap, Game Boy World has really come full circle, don't you think? This seems like a perfect place to bring the first segment of Game Boy World 1990 to a close. And it is, but we won't end quite yet. First, let's finish out June 1990's releases with just a few more episodes. For a brief coda to this rousing crescendo of puzzle madness, keep watching Game Boy World. Next time, an ambitious NES shooter gets a daring Game Boy conversion.